Lazarus was carried by the angels to the bosom of Abraham, Abraham's presence, and the rich man also died and was buried, and he was in Hades. Now, from the context of the whole story here, it's understood that Abraham's bosom, Abraham's presence, where Lazarus was, also was in Hades. Hades is a Greek word. It is the Greek equivalent to the Hebrew word Sheol. So in the Old Testament, we'll see Sheol sometimes gets translated into English, and when it is, it's translated usually as grave, but sometimes pit, sometimes hell. And in the New Testament, we'll see the word Hades, and if it's ever translated into English, it might say hell, might say grave. It's understood to be a place, a location under the ground. Sometimes it's also used as a symbol of death in the New Testament. So the word Hades shows up in more places than just this story. Let's look at a couple of them to see how the Bible uses this word. In Acts 2, Peter is preaching at Pentecost. He said, "Being a prophet, David foresaw this and spoke concerning the resurrection of the Christ, that his soul was not abandoned to Hades, nor did his flesh see corruption." Peter knew his scriptures, and he was referencing here a passage in Psalm 16 that said, "You will not leave my soul in Sheol, nor will you suffer your godly one to see corruption." Peter's explaining that David, who wrote this psalm, was prophesying about the death of Jesus. Okay, another passage in the New Testament that uses the word Hades, Revelation 20. "The sea gave up the dead who were in it, and death and Hades delivered up the dead who were in them, and they were judged, each one by his works. Then death and Hades were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death." Here, Hades is described as something that has dead people in it. It's the grave. And notice too that it's clear from the context here that Hades is not the same thing as the lake of fire. It's not the same thing as the second death, because Hades was cast into the lake of fire. That's a separate concept. I'll talk about that much more in future sessions, but it's important to notice here that Hades is not the same thing as what we typically call hell. What can be confusing, though, is that sometimes the Hebrew word Sheol and the Greek word Hades can be translated into English as hell. So it's very important to understand the context, and if you can, look at the original word, the original language, to understand whether it's talking about the grave or the lake of fire, the second death. So back to Luke 16, the rich man and Lazarus, it's saying that they were in Hades, which is the grave, but this is not the same kind of grave that the Bible talks about. This is a place where, of course, not only people are having conscious experiences, there's also a divide between where Lazarus is in the bosom of Abraham and where the rich man is, in a place where there's fire. There is a great gulf between them, and no one can pass from one side to the other. This is not Hades or the grave as the Bible describes it. This is the Greek model of the underworld. So it's a pagan model of Hades, not a biblical one. In this Greek model, Hades has sections to it, what I'll call the fiery department, and Abraham's bosom, or Abraham's presence. The fiery department is where the rich man is, and there are flames and he's suffering. And at the same time, across the other side of a gulf is Lazarus with Abraham, and it's a cushy, luxurious experience where everything's nice and comfortable. That's the pagan Greek model of Hades, not the biblical model of Hades or the grave. The Bible does not talk about sections, and it doesn't talk about Abraham's bosom or Abraham's presence or Abraham having anything to do with people after they're dead. Unlike this Greek model of the underworld, the Bible talks about a separation of the saved and the lost, the repentant and the unrepentant, but it's not happening in the grave. The separation comes later. In Matthew 25, Jesus said, "When the Son of Man," speaking of himself, "comes in his glory, and all the holy angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. Before him will be gathered all nations, and he will separate them one from another, as a shepherd separates his sheep from the goats." There will be a time when the sheep and the goats are separated, but it's not in the grave. It is when Jesus comes again. There's a prophecy in the Old Testament, the book of Daniel, that says, "The many who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, but others to shame and everlasting contempt." There's a separation, but it is at the time people are resurrected, when they awake from the sleep of death. It's not during death, it's not in the grave, it is after resurrection or at resurrection. Do you see how false doctrine has a way of mixing in some truth? Some of it's right, there will be a separation, but then they mix that truth with lies. It's important to remember that the origins of this story, the rich man and Lazarus, are pagan, Egyptian, with some influence from Babylonian and Greek cultures. These were religions that believed in the immortality of the soul. This story is consistent with that concept, that when you die, you don't really die, you just keep on living. But it's not consistent with what the Bible teaches.